you don't have two manuscripts that are exactly alike. They will differ to one degree or another. So obviously the question becomes, can we know what the original text is in light of all this?
This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining.
Welcome back to another episode of the Bible Sojourner. As you are no doubt aware, being a faithful listener, we are in the midst of a study on the New Testament and where we got it and how it has been preserved through time. And we've had a good friend and colleague of mine, Denis Salgado, helping us think through these issues. He is a part of the Center for the Studies of the New Testament Manuscripts, centered in Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area, and he'll make some more comments about that in this episode. But just really want to emphasize that one of the values of talking about these things is that we can have confidence and knowledge in understanding how we received the Word of God in the original autographs, how that was canonized by the early church, recognizing what God had given to the church, and then how over time those were carefully prepared and copied and preserved for our benefit so that we, now removed 2,000 years plus, can actually read the words that God had given to us through the revelation of his Son and through the apostles, and just great stuff to study. Now, some of it is a little heavy, and it's not for the faint of heart because these are topics that require a little more thinking. And just like we enjoy doing some cultural analysis and things like this, I really do think it's important for churches to be equipped to understand just how we got the Bible through the New Testament side of things, and then how we can understand our texts have developed and how we even receive our English translations. So to help us with that, I'm going to ask Denis Salgado to continue our discussion. And Denis, take it away.
Thank you, Pete. It's a joy again to be here with you and just talking about the story of the New Testament. I've mentioned before that this is part of a curriculum that CSNTM, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscript, has designed basically to walk you through the story of the New Testament in 7 lessons, okay? And we go around the country teaching this material at churches. So if you'd like to hear more about it, do let us know, get in touch with us. And we have been going through, the story of the New Testament from the autographs, everything, all the documents that got this whole story started, and then the collection of New Testament authoritative books, which is the canon, and the process now of copying those books and what scribes copied and how they worked. Now, one of the things that we have kind of mentioned before is that we have over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. And honestly, it's an embarrassment of riches, right? That's what our founder, Daniel Wallace, calls it. And I think he's right. There's so many witnesses to the text of the New Testament that it's hard even to go through all of them. It's not like we are operating with 3 manuscripts to find out what the original text of Romans was. We are operating with hundreds and hundreds of those. And that's what we have to sift through. Now, it is a great thing that we have an embarrassment of riches. The challenge is that not a single manuscript agrees 100% with another, okay? All manuscripts have some kind of difference. And I'll just leave it at that. We can be more technical and talk about textual variants. I won't, versus textual differences. But basically, you don't have 2 manuscripts that are exactly alike. They will differ to one degree or another. So obviously the question becomes, can we know what the original text is in light of all this? All right? In light of all the differences that exist, how do we know? How does the story of the New Testament text look like when you study the text of those manuscripts? All right. So in the previous lesson, we said, hey, your English Bible, God did not drop it, from heaven into a warehouse for you to purchase. Now, your English Bible is not translated out of the blue with some kind of special revelation from God to do that task. It's translated based on a Greek text. This lesson will be, how do we come to that Greek text based on the manuscripts, okay? So let's say, for instance, you are, I don't know, preparing a Bible study in Romans chapter 11. And as a diligent, teacher, it's okay. You don't have to know Greek, but something nice to do is to compare the different English translations available to you. So being a diligent teacher, you are, I don't know, reading something like NIV, or let's take the ESV. Paul writes in Romans 11:6, but if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Amen. And then you said, let me compare this to other Bible translations. I have Accordance or Logos. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of resources. Let me compare this to the KJV, which says, and if by grace, then is it no more of works? Otherwise, grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then is it no more grace? Otherwise, work is no more work. Well, we have a very interesting addition over here in the KJV Bible, bringing into play the issue of works. If it is by works, then it's no longer by grace. Otherwise, work is no longer work. And that blows your mind, right? Like, what is going on? Why? It's not a minor difference. It is actually, it has theological significance. So this lesson today is paving the way for the final one, which is the translation, right? We are looking at the Greek text that is studied across all the manuscript by scholars, or the Greek text that has been studied by scholars throughout the centuries, so that we can have confidence that we are actually reading the original, okay? So that is the goal of this lesson, okay? To pave the way for what serves as the basis for your translation, okay? So there are two major points that we want to highlight today, and we have different parts over here. One is the why and why of New Testament textual criticism. And let me just do a quick parenthesis over here. The word criticism bothers some people in our current society. We're not saying that we're criticizing the Bible. We're just comparing the texts of these manuscripts. You are adjudicating between this reading versus this other reading that you find in the manuscripts. You are using critical thinking, okay, and making judgments. That's what being critical means. So part one, why and what of New Testament textual criticism. Then a brief overview of New Testament textual criticism throughout history, some principles and methods. Again, this is not an intro to New Testament textual criticism. It's just so you know what goes in the back of your English translation. And finally, is what we now have, what the apostles wrote back then. And as you will see, it is a resounding and emphatic yes. All right. So let's move on. We have a lot to talk about the why and why. The why and what. I don't know why I keep saying the why and why. The why and what of the Testament textual criticism. Okay. It's very simple. Okay. We practice textual criticism because the originals no longer exist. And that is true not only for the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, but it's true for any other piece of ancient literature. You may have read the Iliad or the Odyssey, or, I don't know, some kind of history by, a man named Herodotus, or works of Seneca, Well, let me break it to you that you are reading a critical edition. You are reading editions that have been based on the careful comparison of that text across the manuscript tradition. Because the very manuscript that Homer or, I don't know, Seneca or Cicero or whoever wrote centuries and centuries ago, they were not deposited in a clay jar and put in a cave in Qumran, okay, so that we can have access to those originals. No, they were used, passed around, destroyed, and what we have are copies, okay? Originals no longer exist. And then the issue that I've brought up before is that those copies that do exist, they disagree with one another. So you have two reasons over there. Originals don't exist. The copies that do exist disagree with one another at numerous points, at which points we want to find out what the original says, which is already the third reason. People like you want to know what the original says. People like me want to know what the original says or said. So textual criticism becomes important and a necessary step, okay, towards that. So a brief definition of New Testament textual criticism: it's the art and science of determining the original reading of, in this case, the New Testament autographs and the order in which those readings arose. So you're thinking of two issues over here. One is, what did the originals have? And second, the second goal of the discipline is to understand the history of these textual variants and history, the history of the New Testament. The history of these textual variants and textual differences, the order in which they arose, the why, where, and all those things, okay, and how they are all related as well. So that's what textual criticism is, all right? If you desire to know what the original autographs read, then you will greatly benefit, okay, knowing how scholars go about studying the Greek manuscripts and making those decisions that undergird your English Bible. So New Testament textual criticism is a vital step that will lead to the Bible translation that you are reading now, okay? So it's understanding textual criticism that we can understand why in Romans 11:6, the ESV has, the verse in one way and the KJV has that addition over there, all right? So it produces a better understanding of what goes into crafting our own New Testament in English, helps understand our English Bible better. And as Pete already mentioned, it gives us even greater confidence that the text of the New Testament that we have today is the text that was written in the first century, all right? So don't underestimate New Testament textual criticism. I, for one, never thought that I would be in the field of New Testament textual criticism. I was training at Shepherd's Theological Seminary years ago, and in 2015 and 2016, I did 2 independent studies with Andrew Smith, who is a Greek prof at Shepherd's, and it was in 2015 that I was introduced to manuscript studies, got into this project transcribing manuscripts of the pastoral epistles. And I just found that fascinating because, man, I'm actually looking at manuscripts that were produced, 1,000 years ago or hundreds of years ago. And they convey my New Testament that I read. That's how God chose to convey his word. So I guess it gave a concrete aspect to my Greek New Testament and a continuity to it, right? So it was there that I became fascinated with the study. It was at the CRBMI, the Center for the Research of Biblical Manuscripts and Inscriptions. So, and Peter Gaiman is part of that too, right, Pete?
Yes, sir.
He knows everything about Hebrew and Syriac, right? And all that stuff. So if you go to Shepherd's, you will learn a lot from Pete and from Andy Smith on the Greek side of things of the New Testament. So, but I became fascinated because I was looking at these manuscripts that convey my New Testament, and especially this last point, that I have over here, giving me more confidence that, hey, this New Testament that I read every day actually is rooted in history and careful work of scribes and scholars, so that I can know for sure that I have that first century text. All right. Now, New Testament textual criticism, as long as copies have existed, you have had the need for New Testament textual criticism, right? So we'll just go through a brief survey of New Testament textual criticism throughout history. It's not something that liberal scholarship came up with. I remember in my undergraduate degree doing Bachelor of Theology, one of the profs introduced us to criticism, and you have lower criticism and higher criticism, and some of which are a little bit, liberal, others are not. Some people get scared away by the word textual criticism, thinking that it's the same as, other forms of criticism that attack the reliability of the Bible and the character of God. That's not true, okay? Textual criticism is not evil. Textual criticism is trying to do a wonderful thing, which is take us back to that original and help us understand how our New Testament was transmitted throughout history. So as long as copies have existed, you have had the need for this. So it's nothing new. So in the early period, you have examples such as Irenaeus, all right, already 2nd century. He is wrestling with the number of the beast. I'm sure you have wrestled with it in different ways, right? What is the meaning of the number of the beast? Do I find the number of the beast in the barcode of products today? Oh my goodness, that scares me to death. Or if I'm using a, restroom in the gas station and I find 666, does that mean, is that a nomen? I don't know how you have wrestled with 666 in different ways. Or if you're watching, a suspense or horror movie, 666 shows up. Well, some people in the 2nd century would not write 666. They would write 616. What? Yes, there is a textual variant involving the number of the beast. And that textual variant is, instead of 666, it's 616. And Irenaeus, one of the church fathers, apostolic fathers, is trying to deal with this. He writes, now, such being the state of the case, and this number being set down in all the good and old copies. Listen to Irenaeus. He's talking about the good and old copies. And testimony given by the persons themselves who had seen John with their eyes, and reason teaching us that the number of the name of the beast, according to the Greeks' reckoning by the letters therein, will have 666, that is, as many tens as hundreds, and as many hundreds as units. For the number or digit 6 being retained in all alike indicates the summings up of his whole apostasy, which shall be both in the beginning and in the intermediate times and in the end. Some, I know not how, have erred, following a particular reading, and have taken liberties with the middle number of the name, subtracting the value of 50, and choosing to have 1 decade instead of 6. And this I suppose to have been the fault of the transcribers, as often happens, since numbers also are expressed by letters. That the Greek letter, which expresses the number 60, was spread out into the Grecian's letter iota or iota. So it's interesting. Of course, we don't agree with, Irenaeus. He's trying to come up with a logical explanation for why it should be 666. He gives 3 reasons, basically. The first one, we agree. It is in the best and oldest copies. Wow. He is in the 2nd century, okay? Between 130 and 180. Revelation was written, in the 90s. So he's about, 50 years removed from the original, and he's already talking about the best and old copies. All right? He talks about people who were with John and heard from John's mouth that the number was 666. So basically, Irenaeus in the first point is going back to uh, the old copies, going back as far as possible in time and consulting the most ancient authorities and evidence for the reading 666, which is also something that we still do today. Okay, we go back to the most ancient authorities to look at what they said and compare those. They don't agree 100%, but we compare them. All right. Well, he had the privilege of consulting the contemporaries of John, which we do not have that luxury. So we still work with other witnesses, and hundreds of them, meaning the manuscripts, to see what the text read. The third one, logically, the beast should have 3 identical numbers. We disagree with him on that. I mean, he's using an interesting argument over here. It's the full apostasy represented by, the middle, the intermediate, and the final number. We don't have to go there. Maybe you do. But from the perspective of textual criticism, we would not argue that way. But there's another point over here that he makes at the very end. He talks about scribal habits, right? And in our previous lesson, if you remember, if you haven't watched that one, go back and watch it, because we talked about unintentional changes and intentional changes. One of the unintentional changes that scribes made was just confusion that derived from hearing, some confusion derived from eyesight. So this is one of them. Scribes often, as it often happens, he says, scribes have the tendency to make a mistake over here because the Greek numbers are very often represented in the manuscript by 3 letters instead of being written in full. So that may have created confusion in the for some scribes. All right. So basically, Irenaeus is doing much of what we have been doing in modernity as well, is going back to the most ancient witnesses. We are looking at scribal habits and weighing the evidence accordingly. All right. Now, we are going to make a huge jump over here, okay, from the 2nd century to the 15th century. I know I did not promise a full study in the history of textual criticism. This is just, to show you that we did not come up with textual criticism in the last decade. Scribes, and I touched on this, scribes themselves, when they were copying and correcting Greek manuscripts, they were practicing textual criticism. Remember that example that I gave in Codex Vaticanus 03, Gregory Allen 03, in Hebrews 1, verse 3? One scribe rebuking the other and saying, "You are learned wretch, don't change the reading. Keep the old reading," right? So that guy was practicing what? Textual criticism. He was going back to the old reading, all right? So this is just to show you that textual criticism is nothing new. Now, in the 15th century, we have this extremely important individual. It's hard to overstate the importance of Erasmus and not only New Testament textual criticism, but all sorts of studies in the classics. Okay, extremely influential person. So one of the things that he did, kind of reaching the climax of his maturity as a scholar, was the publication of his first edition of the Greek New Testament, dated to 1516. Right. So he was a Dutch scholar who traveled around Europe a lot, France, Italy, especially England, and a humanist who grew over time and has understanding of himself as a scholar, as a Christian scholar, and applying all his knowledge of the classics towards now religious studies. And the major fruit was an edition of the Greek New Testament, the first one published by the printing press. Okay, we talked about the printing press very briefly in the last session. They did have printing press in Venice and in Basel, and that's where he published the first one in Basel. And the text of Erasmus was, there were other editions in the 20s as well, but that text eventually becomes the received text, or the Textus Receptus. All right. And his text has shaped much of the discussion of New Testament textual criticism up to this day. All right. Even 500 years later, we're still talking about this guy and his text. All right. So the first edition of Erasmus in 1516 did not have the Trinitarian formula or the Comma Ioanneum in 1 John 5, 7, and 8. Again, if you read the KJV as opposed to the ESV, you will find a difference over there. In the KJV, you read, "For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three are one." So his first edition did not have this Trinitarian formula, but apparently he came across a Greek manuscript later, and he then added the Trinitarian formula in his subsequent editions. And that deserves to be, studied for sure. It's a very fascinating conversation and discussion.
Not to interrupt, but I have to. Just, I don't know if I ever mentioned this, but I did write an article on Erasmus one time. I don't know how I got that opportunity, but I wrote an article to publish in a journal. And when I was studying him, one of the things, just to piggyback on what you were saying, just because he is such a fascinating character,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that I found super fascinating is that when because he was, collating, it's not like he was copying one manuscript to print at the printer. He had these 7 manuscripts that he was working together to combine into readings. But the interesting thing that I think about that process was that he did not have a complete manuscript of Revelation when he was doing that.
That's right.
And so
Yes.
one of the fascinating stories about that text, what ends up becoming the Textus Receptus through his work, is that in order to complete the book of Revelation, since he didn't have a complete one, he took a Latin manuscript of Revelation and back translated it into Greek, and then made a note saying that when somebody finds a manuscript, because he didn't have access to it, when somebody else gets a manuscript of Revelation in Greek, then I want them to substitute that. But to this day, the Textus Receptus still carries on that tradition of his back translation from Latin, which is just a fascinating anecdote. And the reason I wanted to bring that up was because some listeners and viewers know that I've talked a lot about King James in various contexts. And so it's just really helpful to know some of these things, and it shows how Erasmus himself was trying to do his best, and he did so great for the tools that he had available, just working all these manuscripts together. And I love that you talked about him as kind of being a major figure in this history of textual criticism, because he definitely, again, with just not the tools we have at all, just did such a great job of doing of collating a lot of these readings, and then giving one eclectic text of the New Testament.
That's right. Unfortunately, he had access to very few manuscripts, and they were late, right? They were post, 10th century. He did not have access to the papyri that we have, or the major codices such as Codex Sinaiticus or Vaticanus and many others. So his text, of course, has its limitations. One of the main ones being what you said about Revelation. And he created so many textual variants in those final verses of Revelation, and readings that we cannot find in any New Testament Greek manuscript of Revelation, because he was translating from the Latin into the Greek. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And again, the Textus Receptus is not something that Erasmus created. Okay, I hope our listeners are understanding this. The Textus Receptus is not something that Erasmus sat down and produced. He produced the first critical edition based on a handful of manuscripts dated to the 11th century onwards, with its limitations. And that text is re-edited later, not only by himself in the following decade, but also by Stephanus in the middle of the century. You have Stephanus publishing 4 editions of the Greek New Testament, 1546, 49, 1551. And then you have in the following century, in the early 1600s, again, now we are in the time of the King James Bible, right, 16 and 11. You have the Elzevir brothers also around that time re-editing the editions of Stephanus and Erasmus. But that text of Revelation stayed on over there and made its way into the King James Bible, because the King James Bible is based on the text of, these guys, Erasmus, Stephanus, and the Elzevirs. So it is a translation. I mean, the text is good, of course, but it will have some differences compared to the ESV, because the Greek text underlying the ESV is a different kind of text. It's a critical text based on more ancient witnesses or manuscripts. All right. So, all right, let's move on now. So a lot transpired between Erasmus and these two guys over here, Westcott and Hort. And why do we skip a bunch of people? One, we don't have time to talk about all of them. And two, Westcott and Hort are credited with dethroning the Textus Receptus. Again, Erasmus did not set out with an agenda to create a text that would become the queen for several centuries. It just so happened that the Textus his text became this entity, the Textus Receptus. And in 1633, and we have an edition over here in our office, in 1633 you have the edition of the Elzevirs, and that is when, in the preface, you find a text received by all, right? And at which point it becomes known as a Textus Receptus, or the received text. And it sits on the throne of Greek text, New Testament, and it stays over there. We can see that the Textus Receptus became something like the Vulgate was for the Catholic Church, all right? So you would not mess with the Latin Vulgate. You would not translate the Latin Vulgate. You would not go back to the Greek or the Hebrew, because Jerome's Vulgate had been around for 1,000 years. That was the Roman Catholic Church Bible. So the Textus Receptus became something like that, very authoritative, until after the contribution of many scholars, okay, until finally Westcott and Hort, they debunked and dethroned the Textus Receptus. It's kind of unfair to say that, because you have people like Tregellus and many others who were eroding the structure of the Textus Receptus for a while. In 1707, you have John Mill. He's regarded as the father of modern New Testament textual criticism. He collected, he consulted, 99 Greek manuscripts, many more than, Erasmus had, of course. And he came across 30,000 variants over there. That's in 1707. And he published his edition in 1707 and created a huge commotion, and died two weeks later. And he created this huge commotion because now you have a New Testament with 30,000 differences, and many scholars, both in Germany and in the UK, came out in his defense saying, hey, it is better for us to consult all these hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts and check all these points of differences, because we can compare them, and that will give us more confidence about the original text. If all we had was 2 manuscripts, whenever they disagreed, the chances would be 50-50, right? But because we have so many, we can compare them more carefully and have a better footing on our decisions. All right. So that was how they defended John Mill's edition and the 30,000 variants that he found. But you had people like John Mill, Bengal, Griesbach, and Lachmann, and many others, Strigelis, and many others, especially in the UK and in Germany, okay? Developing, polishing the discipline of New Testament textual criticism, developing principles, applying those principles, publishing editions. And so you have about 200 years of development over there, which led up to finally Westcott and Hort publishing their edition. And they relied primarily on Codex Vaticanus, okay, Gregory Alan 03, and said that Codex Vaticanus is this neutral text. It's a great text that we should base our New Testament on. But they by going back to more ancient witnesses, they were able to show that the Textus Receptus was not a good text, all right? And these guys, kind of like Erasmus, they have been so influential to the point that our critical editions to this day, over 100 years later, still heavily based on their principles and the work that these guys did. And even in their text, we don't agree with some of their theories, but the text that they produced was an excellent text. All right. So they demonstrated that the manuscripts that made up what was seen as the most sacred and inspired form of Greek text, the Textus Receptus, was actually a later text. All right. Later than other kinds of texts. And this is still accepted to this day. All right. And then you have, in modern day, you have several organizations contributing in one way or another to textual criticism and the production of critical editions that underline your English translations. So when your pastor says, "Oh, I went to the Greek," when he's preaching, he means he went to the Nestle Aland edition or the UBS edition, which are critical editions. It's the same text. And these are produced by teams of scholars around the world, and it's a highly collaborative effort. It's not one person publishing an edition anymore like it used to be. It's just a global effort. So you have the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, INTF, out of the University of Münster. Here's a mug, in case you were wondering. They do have mugs. So they edit the text. It's a team of scholars, and they published the German Bible Society in Stuttgart, Germany. They published the critical editions of UBS and Nestle Aland. That's what your favorite exegete will use to exegete the text of the New Testament. The IGNTP is the International Greek New Testament Project that's been going on for several decades now, since the middle of the last century. And what they do is they provide transcriptions of Greek manuscripts and put those transcriptions in digital form so the text can be analyzed, compared, all right? And how do they do that? They go to images of manuscripts, all right? And when it comes to images of manuscripts, you have this other entity over here, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which is us. That's how we contribute.
Now, I have to jump in here, Dennis, and clarify a couple things, just because I know some people are thinking, wait, so all Christians need to be, studying this? No, you didn't say that. But I do think it's important to understand that most Christians aren't going to be involved in efforts like this. I mean, for one, maybe they're not trained in Greek or Hebrew and they're not capable of being able to evaluate those kinds of things. But one of the things that you mentioned, which I really think is key, is that every pastor who's going to the original languages is a beneficiary of these works. And all Christians, therefore, are beneficiaries of people
That's
like
right.
yourself who are involved in these process these processes. And I just think as Christians, we need to, recognize that. Again, like it's not for everybody. In fact, it's for very few kinds of people who are really driven in these areas, because you have to be trained very specifically and specially, but then also you have to have the opportunities that these kinds of organizations provide through donors and things like that to do that. But all that to say is that we are, as Christians throughout the world, we are all beneficiaries of these kinds of projects. So I think that's really important to recognize. Now, I also need to clarify that, for the work that you guys do at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, I can't help but notice even behind you, there's some machinery there that kind of, I guess we could say it helps with what you do. So maybe you could just describe just a little bit more of like how that works for what you guys do specifically at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts.
That's right. So what you have behind me here is our digitization equipment. So one of the things that we do, besides teaching this curriculum and training the next generation of scholars, is the original goal of the organization is to digitize and digitally preserve manuscripts of the New Testament, Greek manuscripts primarily. And when everything got started by Dan Wallace over 20 years ago, he was using, 4 or 5 megapixel cameras, digital cameras that were available at the time, and a little contraption over there, a tripod, and they made it work. And we still have some of those images on our archives, in our archives. It's pretty cool. But nowadays, we've come a long way since then. And what you see behind me, it's the highest that you can get in the market. It's the digital transitions, the DT Atom equipment that was designed for digital preservation of antiquities. And the camera that's over there, it's a phase 1 camera, 150 megapixel
Oh,
camera.
man.
And the lights are 5,000 Kelvin that replicate the sunlight, but it's cold, so it doesn't harm us or the manuscripts. So this is a very nice equipment. There's a cradle over there that you can see behind me. It's covered with a black cloth, but there's a very nice cradle that is adjustable. It has springs, so you can carefully, put your baby manuscript over there and digitize it and without causing any damage. So this is a pretty cool equipment that we have. It's not fixed here in this room. We actually break it down, believe it or not, into 6 large cases that our colleague here designed, and they fly internationally as oversized luggage, or they can be shipped by a shipping service or something. Whenever we go, we travel domestically, like we did to Massachusetts and New York 2 weeks ago. We just pack everything in a Suburban, like a large SUV. Everything fits over there. It takes us about 20 minutes to disassemble and 45 minutes to put it back together. And then we just set it up and digitize the manuscript over there. Come back home. The images are then post-processed by our team over here and made available to the holding institutions and scholars at large. They go on our website. And those are the images, okay, that scholars around the world, transcribers around the world are using. They transcribe the text because images are great, but all they can do is show you what the text says, because they don't give you the text. They don't put the text in digital form, right? So you have to grab the text, shall we say, of those manuscripts and put in a computer software somehow. And that is done by transcribers working for in projects for INTF or for IGNTP. I was part of a IGNTP project that I mentioned, 2015, 2016, transcribing manuscripts of 1 Timothy for the critical edition, the Editio Critica Maior of Paul, of the pastoral epistles, whose editor is no other than Andy Smith, who is at Shepherd's Theological Seminary, the CRBMI. He is one of the editors he is the editor of the pastoral epistles in the whole Pauline corpus. So I was part of that project, transcribing manuscripts and using images whenever they are available, high resolution images that CSNTM digitizes and all that. And for my own dissertation and my PhD studies, I used hundreds of images that were produced by CSNTM. So yeah, that's our baby in the back of here. We also have multispectral imaging equipment for, different kinds of images and situations. So you have another entity. It's called the Tyndale House, Cambridge. You may be familiar with people like Dirk Jonken and Peter Williams. And Dirk Jonken has edited one Greek New Testament. The Tyndale House produced it under his leadership, and they're now in the process of publishing a textual commentary and a second edition of that critical edition, which is pretty cool because now we can compare the work produced by the Tyndale House with the work produced by INTF and see how they might differ in one way or another in their text, but they're basically the same. All right, they correspond to each other, operating based on very similar principles. Speaking of principles and methods for this whole enterprise, that's textual criticism. And if there is a guiding principle, a fundamental principle, it is this: the reading which best explains the rise of the others is likely to be the original. So if you are comparing manuscripts and you come across one reading, several competing readings, the principle is which reading explains why the others evolved and came to be, right? So you need this initial reading, right, that gave rise to the others. And obviously that initial reading that gave rise to the others is most likely to be the original reading, right? And for the task, we also use certain, criteria and different kinds of evidence. So we use internal evidence, meaning what is it that the author most likely wrote over here? That's intrinsic probability. So we consider the context of a passage. We consider the style of the author whenever that's possible. That there are limitations to that. Think of Jude, for instance. Can we talk about the style of Jude? I don't think we can. Some might disagree. But you have 25 verses. Is that sufficient data for us to develop a profile of, Jude as an author? That's a very tricky and flimsy data set, right? So style can be used, but just be aware that it has its limitations. However, when you come across something that is remarkably different, style helps. If you read your Bible, your Gospel of Mark, from cover to cover, from chapter 1 through chapter 16, all the way to the end, verse 20, you will notice, even in English, that there is a remarkable difference in the style, the words, the structure, the content. The same is true for John and the pericope of the woman caught in adultery. You will notice in English the difference in style and vocabulary and other things. All right. Still part of this internal kind of evidence is not only what the authors most likely wrote, but what is it that scribes most likely copied? Again, going back to our previous talk, there were intentional changes, unintentional changes. There are scribal practices, scribal proclivities that we have to be aware to. We have to study them, and those will inform us as to a given, textual variant, why a given manuscript has that. One of the papyri manuscripts, the copyists seem to have had a tendency to exalt the divinity of Jesus. So if that is the profile of that scribe, whenever we come across readings in that manuscript that differ from the others, and the difference relates to Christology, well, that is a very relevant piece of information. This scribe over here may have changed the text. It seems that he changed the text a few times to uphold a high Christology. So that's scribal habits and things that are important for us to know, part of internal evidence. All right. If you have internal evidence By necessity, you have external evidence, okay? And by external evidence, we mean, the manuscripts, all right? And the manuscripts, we consider the date of those manuscripts. Remember, Irenaeus, we do want to go back as far as possible in time and consider those ancient witnesses. So the date is important. The character of manuscripts is important. That is a principle developed by Westcott and Hort. Before you make any judgment on readings, you have to know the documents. So knowledge of documents should precede final judgment upon readings. That is a sine qua non, it's a non-negotiable principle in New Testament textual criticism. Okay, geographical distribution is also another principle that some scholars follow. It has its limitations. It's important because if you have a manuscript that has one reading over here and only this manuscript has this reading, we may postulate that this manuscript, or I'm sorry, that this reading is localized. It was part of this, community of believers at some point. Yes, maybe a reading was more common, circulated more common in Palestine, or in the West, in Italy. That is definitely possible. It seems to be the case in many readings. But just like today, people tended to travel back in the days, and they would also bring their books with them. So that means that, readings that were common in Egypt may have traveled to, Greece or traveled to Italy. So geographical distribution is important, but it has its limitations as well because documents, they circulated, they traveled around. All right. Now, when it comes to assembling the evidence and producing a critical edition, you have an image over there of the the Epistle to the Romans, and that is chapter 1 of Romans. Once we gather all this evidence, and text critics believe they have arrived, at this earliest text, they create a critical edition, all right? They publish a text that they think is the earliest attainable text. And the text comes accompanied by those footnotes that you see over there. That's called a critical apparatus. And the critical apparatus is not designed to give you all the information necessary and all the manuscripts that have, this or that reading. It's basically to highlight the most important aspects in the textual history of the Greek New Testament, important manuscripts that have different readings, and there's a reason why those were selected to be there. As you can imagine, that footnote is prime real estate, so those are carefully selected to be included over there. All right, so a critical edition will have a critical apparatus telling you, hey, these are the readings available to us in the manuscript edition, the most important ones, the most relevant ones, and these are the manuscripts, the most important ones, the most relevant ones that attest this or that reading. All right. And this page comes from the 28th edition of the Nestle Awan Critical Edition, published by the German Bible Society. And let's take for example over here. Let's take for instance the in verse 1 of chapter 1 you have Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, and you have some squiggly lines around Christ Jesus, Christu Jesu, and you go all the way down to 1, in bold, and then you see the squiggly line, and then all those numbers, those letters, and that's telling me which manuscripts have Christ Jesus and which manuscripts have Jesus Christ. All right, that's what it's doing. So that's how you read a critical apparatus. I know it's perhaps much more than you wanted to know, but this is what exegetes are using. So if you pick up a commentary by Schreiner in Romans, that's what Schreiner is using. He's not using another text, a Greek text, to exegete. He's using the Nestle Aland Critical Edition. All right. This is also what Bible translators will use, not necessarily in the shape of this Nestle Aland edition like this, but the UBS text, the United Bible Society's text, which has a slightly different apparatus, critical apparatus, but one designed for translators. All right. So, is what we have now what they wrote then? All right. It's the $1 million question that we all want to know. So we have an enormous amount of witnesses, right, to the ancient text, and we want to consider these witnesses to go back to the original. More variants are actually better for getting to the earliest readings. So that was a discovery made by uh, John Mill and scholars who were defending him. Hey, we have more manuscripts that differ, and they show all the differences, so that gives us better foundation to go back to what the original said. All right. So don't be scared by all these, differences that you see in the critical apparatus. That is actually good. That gives us more evidence to work with. Again, if we have had only 2 or 3 manuscripts and they differed, well, then you have a 50-50 or a 33% chance to be right of one of them having the right text. But because we have so many manuscripts, we can make a better assessment. And again, less than 1% of textual variants are meaningful and viable. So in a word, yes, we can have a great deal of confidence, that what we have now is what the apostles wrote back then. All right. And this is the text that will lead us to the translation, to your English translation, unless you're using the King James Version, which again is a good Bible, but it's based on a different text. It's based on the Textual Receptus, not on the critical text. But most of the translations out there, if you're reading the NIV, the SV, the Net Bible, the NASB, it's going to be based on this text, and that's how this text comes about, by the work of New Testament text critics. And here are some resources on that for you. Thanks, Pete.
That's great. Thank you, Dennis. And, one of the things that I love about this is I teach at seminary a Old Testament textual criticism class, and it's just a lot of fun having taken New Testament textual criticism in seminary to be, to see the overlap in a lot of the even principles, like when you gave the main principle is just really cool, because that's what I always tell the students too from the Old Testament side of things, is that this is often the guiding principle to help you understand the evidence and help you understand how things have developed. So there's a lot of work into it, and but it's good and necessary part of the process. And so I appreciate you walking us through that kind of at a high level. And some people, I'm sure, really are eating this up. Some people are like, okay, now I want to move on. But it's important to do it in this order, because I think I gave this example earlier, where when you are talking about your English translation, there's actually an entire conversation that needs to be had prior to that about what text are the translators working from, and then within that text, how are there differences that derive in methodology. So just really important as Christians to be well suited to answer those kinds of questions. It's, I think you would probably agree with me on this, Dennis. So I'm confidently going forward saying that you would endorse this statement, is that it's much more important for Christians to be well educated in these things than to just be given simple answers saying, well, you don't need to understand, just go with it. That's how disaster happens, like you had mentioned, I think, in the first one.
Yes. One of the major issues is that we just grow up reading this and not understanding the mechanics behind it. And whenever somebody comes to us and says, "Hey, by the way, there's so many discrepancies in your New Testament that it's not reliable. You shouldn't trust it." And maybe it's a friend in college, right? Or a professor in college, or somebody in, high school, or your neighbor, or your coworker, and they show those discrepancies. They point you to, I don't know, a podcast or uh, some kind of teaching going on online by scholars, and they are just showing how all of these differences in the manuscripts, they mean that you can never go back to the original. You can never know what Jesus actually said or did or Paul actually taught. So whenever somebody, if we're not educated, whenever somebody comes and shows us these things, we have a crisis, right? Existential crisis. Should we really trust in the Testament? I don't think I should. All these differences, So that is happening. That has happened and still happens a lot. So what we're trying to do is, instead of giving just bits of information like short answers, is okay. Let's educate the church. Let's educate Christians, so that whenever they come across these arguments, they have a solid foundation. All right, to stand on and be able to answer and think for themselves, and not become just anxious or desperate or lose faith over differences that we see in manuscripts.
That's great, and really appreciate you walking us through that, and appreciate the work that you guys are doing at the CSNTM. As always, I will put a link in the description to the CSNTMs. You can find out more about their work there. And as Dennis has mentioned in the past as well, if your church is interested in even having Dennis or one of the other guys there come and present to the church, field some questions, I know that's a great opportunity. They'd love to be a part of that. And if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, you can reach out to me or to Dennis. You can contact me on the contact form on my website, petergaming.com. And next time, we will conclude our series with a discussion of English translations. So make sure you stay tuned to that. Until that time, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine upon you.